So your shadow isn't poetry, it's physics.
Right. It's an absolute non-negotiable compliance to a universal law.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you stand outside, you're watching it stretch out long and thin across the pavement as the sun sets. And, you might think of it as this beautiful, peaceful, aesthetic moment.
Which is how most people look at it,
But then
naturally.
step into the world of rationalist philosophy, and that image just gets completely flipped on its head.
Because we are no longer looking at a trick of the light, we're looking at involuntary submission.
Yes, involuntary submission. Because everything in the physical universe, from a tiny pebble to a swirling galaxy to, like, the shadow cast by your own body, it all obeys a hard, unyielding mathematical reality.
And that's exactly what we are getting into today.
Right. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we are using the deeply rationalist framework of Allama Parwez to really uncover why your shadow follows the rules perfectly, while human civilizations, well, they consistently choose to architect their own destruction.
It's a fascinating contrast. And for this deep dive, we are dissecting Lecture 315 from the Tului Islam Digital Archive.
Yep, focusing heavily on Parwez's analysis of Surah An-Nahl, specifically verses 37 through 52, right?
Exactly. And what Parwez executes here is not theology in the orthodox sense at all. It is this intense intellectual breakdown of sociology, psychology, and physical laws, all through a Quranic lens.
Yeah, he takes these concepts that have basically been shrouded in centuries of mysticism and just demands that we look at them empirically.
Which means we are totally bypassing the standard spiritual reflections today.
Oh, absolutely. If you're familiar with Parwez's work, you know he insists the text is talking about the material world. We are looking at economics, political power monopolies, human emotional struggles.
We're basically redefining the very mechanics of how a society either thrives or completely collapses.
Okay, so let's jump right into the core of it. What's the central tension here?
Well, the central tension Parwez extracts from these verses really revolves around two massive concepts: universal submission and the verification of guidance.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So the analysis opens in verse 37 with this really deep psychological profile of the messenger. He's locked in a state of intense, almost unbearable grief.
Right, and the Arabic word used there is hers, correct?
Yes, hers. And traditionally, that's usually translated as like an extreme greed or an overpowering desire.
Right, which sounds super negative, but Parwez completely recontextualizes this, doesn't he?
He does. He says it isn't a selfish greed for wealth or power. It is this overwhelming, desperate, emotional yearning to save his opponents from the catastrophic consequences of their own toxic social system.
Wow, okay. So he is actively watching the Meccan elite double down on an oppressive structure, and he's just consumed with this desire to pull them back from the cliff.
Exactly. Which brings us face to face with a really cold, stark reality that the text establishes.
The divine law of consequences.
You got it. The divine law of consequences is absolute. Even the intense, pure emotional desire of a prophet cannot override cause and effect.
Right, I mean, you cannot love a society out of the consequences of its own structural violence.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It makes me think of a medical analogy. Think of a world-class physician, like the most brilliant, empathetic doctor on the planet.
Okay, I follow.
This doctor can weep for their patient, right? They can spend sleepless nights researching cures, but if that patient stubbornly refuses the treatment and actively chooses to drink a slow-acting poison every single day.
The doctor's empathy has absolutely no biochemical power to rewrite human biology.
Exactly. The poison will execute its biological imperative. The law of consequences does not care about the doctor's tears.
The poison just does what poison does. The biological law takes effect. And Parwez uses this exact tension to dive into a highly sophisticated psychoanalytical distinction.
Between the self and the ego, right? Yes.
Because a really persistent fallacy in a lot of spiritual traditions is this idea that to attain a higher state of being, you have to become selfless.
Like you have to annihilate the self until you're just this passive blank slate.
Right, but Parwez forcefully rejects that. I mean, modern psychoanalysts will tell you the core, personality, the I, it cannot be destroyed without inducing severe neurosis or complete psychological collapse.
Because the self is the operational foundation of human existence.
Exactly. The messenger in this text does not have a destroyed self. He has a massively powerful, fully integrated self.
So what's the distinction he's making then, if it's not about destroying the self?
The critical distinction Parwez draws is between a self driven by ego and a self driven by a higher mission.
Okay, so when the self is hijacked by the ego, every action becomes fiercely transactional.
Precisely. The primary operating question of the ego is always, what is my compensation? Where is my reward?
Which totally defines the Meccan power structure at the time. It was built entirely on this transactional ego. Everything was commodified.
Yes, but the messenger operates entirely outside that paradigm. He is engaged in this exhausting, decades-long socio-political struggle.
I mean, he's facing warfare, economic boycotts, constant hostility.
And he's doing it without ever demanding a wage from the people he is trying to liberate.
Which is why the Meccan elite just could not compute him. They couldn't understand a non-transactional actor.
Right. They assumed he must be playing some sort of long game for a kingship or, hidden wealth.
And when it became super clear he wasn't doing that, their confusion just turned into mockery.
And that mockery is so revealing. It exposes how entrenched power structures view marginalized challengers. The Meccans were an organized, wealthy, monopolistic entity.
They were the establishment, and they're looking at the early Muslims who were this marginalized group, stripped of their wealth, lacking a standing army.
Essentially internal refugees.
Yeah, and the Meccans swore oaths that God would never raise the dead.
And this is where Parwez's linguistic analysis radically shifts the perspective.
Yeah, let's get into this because this blew my mind. We are so conditioned to hear raising the dead and instantly jump to theology.
Right, the literal afterlife, graves opening up, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But Parwez anchors the word bath back into its sociological context.
He really does. The root meaning of bath is actually to awaken, to liberate, to remove overwhelming obstacles from a path so that something can rise.
Right. So the Meccan elite weren't engaging in some abstract theological debate about the mechanics of the afterlife.
Not at all. They were engaging in political trash talk.
They were looking at a severely oppressed, economically starved underclass, a dead nation in sociological terms.
Their oath were declarations of absolute systemic dominance. They were basically saying, these destitute refugees are dead in the water. They have no capital, no alliances.
The socio-economic laws dictate they will never rise up and challenge our monopoly. It's functionally impossible.
But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the laws governing society. They believed their monopoly made them immune to consequence.
Which is a classic mistake of empires. The divine law dictates that a system built on extraction and oppression will inevitably fracture.
While a system built on sound, equitable principles actually possesses inherent vitality.
Which forces a huge strategic decision for the oppressed, right? And that leads us directly into Parwez's analysis of verse 41.
Yes, the concept of hijra. Now, the traditional Orthodox framing of hijra is almost universally painted with this brush of sorrow and religious retreat.
Right. It's always depicted as this tragic flight of persecuted people running away just so they can, perform their rituals in peace.
But Parwez strips away that passive framing entirely. He redefines it as social physics.
I love that term, social physics. It frames it as a deliberate, brilliant socio-economic strategy.
Because when an established system becomes structurally toxic to human dignity,
when the economic rules are so rigged that simply participating in the market forces you to be complicit in oppression.
Exactly. When that happens, the rational response is not passive martyrdom. Staying and suffering endlessly under a rigged monopoly is a mathematical failure.
So the strategic move is capital flight and human defection. You withdraw your participation, your labor, and your intellect from their economy.
You abandon the monopoly to build a new, viable society based on structural equity. The text actually uses the term hasana here.
Hasana, which implies a structurally sound, beautifully balanced state or a goodly home.
Yes.
To put this in a modern context, consider the mechanics of a massive tech giant today.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Imagine a corporation that totally dominates the global market, but its internal architecture is incredibly toxic. It exploits its workforce, it stifles genuine innovation, and operates on pure extraction.
Right, a complete monopoly.
The most brilliant engineers inside that machine don't just sit in their cubicles for 40 years complaining about the culture.
No, they calculate the structural failure of the company and they defect.
They leave the multi-billion-dollar campus and they set up shop in a dusty garage with zero funding and no server farms.
And to the executives at the monopoly, these engineers look exactly like the dead nation the Meccans mocked.
Exactly. They look like failures who surrendered their lucrative positions. But those engineers aren't retreating. They are architecting a completely disruptive paradigm.
Because their foundational code, Their culture, their resource allocation is mathematically and ethically sound.
So they will inevitably build the very product that renders the massive monopoly obsolete.
But the friction of that defection is immense. We have to acknowledge that. The source material highlights that the oppressed early Muslims left with literally nothing.
They face the organized might of the entire Meccan state apparatus.
But Parwez argues this mirrors the macro-historical shifts we see constantly in human history. Seemingly powerless refugee communities often out-innovate and outlast massive empires.
Because the empires rot from the inside out. Their internal laws are toxic.
While the marginalized group is forced by sheer necessity to construct a resilient, equitable system, it is the inescapable physics of societal development.
Wow. But implementing that new system requires a specific type of leadership, doesn't it? Which brings up a major historical objection that Parwez tackles in verse 43.
Right, the elite's constant demand for a miracle. The established elite continually demanded a supernatural spectacle.
They argued, if this blueprint for a new society is genuinely divine, why is it being delivered by just a human being?
A guy who walks through the markets, who needs to sleep, who gets exhausted like anyone else.
Yeah, they're like, why didn't an angel manifest to hand down the Constitution?
The demand for a magical apparition is actually a desire to bypass the messy, arduous work of societal reform.
Which Parwez counters with what he calls the logic of the messenger.
Yes. The Amner, which is the divine command or the constitutional blueprint, it must be manifested and proven viable within the friction of human society.
Through human agency. Because, honestly, an angel is sociologically useless.
Completely useless. An angel doesn't have a localized economy to navigate.
Right. An angel doesn't have a spouse or children or the physical fatigue of organizing a community defense during a siege.
If a supernatural being descended and lived a perfect life, the human population would simply shrug and say, well, sure, perfection is easy for a creature made of light.
Exactly. They'd say, we are made of biology and constrained by scarcity. Your model doesn't apply to our earthly reality.
So the guide must be entirely human to prove that the divine principles actually function under the stress of human earthly problems.
And this necessity for human empirical proof leads Parwez to one of his most radical linguistic deep dives.
Yes, regarding the term al-Adikr.
Right, because the traditional translation of al-Adikr almost always defaults to a priestly class, or mystics.
Or scholars of purely religious rituals. The assumption was always that the text is saying, if you have a question about the universe, go ask the guy in the robes who spends all day in the temple.
But Parwez completely dismantles that by returning to the root linguistics.
He redefines al-Adikr as those who possess recorded knowledge, historical records, and empirical data.
He shifts the epistemology entirely away from mysticism and anchors it in historical empiricism.
The text is issuing a direct challenge to the skeptics. It's saying, don't look for magic. Go ask the historians.
Consult the sociologists and the scholars of past civilizations. Review the empirical data of human history.
And you will find that every single successful, equitable civilization was guided by human intellects establishing sound laws, not by magical beings floating down from the sky.
Okay, let me push back on Parwez's logic here for just a second.
Yeah, go for it.
The source text explicitly addresses the idea of physical miracles, like pulling milk out of a solid stone. From a purely pragmatic societal building standpoint, wouldn't a supernatural miracle actually be a highly efficient way to establish authority?
Well, what do you mean by efficient?
I mean, if a leader squeezed milk from a boulder in front of thousands of people, you wouldn't need a decades-long socio-economic struggle. The people would instantly submit to whatever economic policy that leader proposed.
Ah, but the efficiency you're describing is exactly the danger Parwez is highlighting.
Really? How so?
The Quran, in his analysis, explicitly rejects the bypassing of human intellect. Parwez argues that true belief in societal stability cannot be founded on ikra.
Ikra. And that goes beyond just holding a sword to someone's neck, right?
Far beyond it. Ikra is compulsion, yes, but in this context, it is the intellectual and emotional subjugation of a population.
Oh, wow.
If you use a supernatural impossibility to force compliance, you are basically short-circuiting the human brain. You are overwhelming their critical faculties.
So the people aren't adopting your socioeconomic system because they rationally understand it to be just, equitable, and sustainable.
Exactly. They are submitting because their nervous systems are terrified or hopelessly dazzled.
And a society built on a magic trick is incredibly fragile. What happens when the magician dies or leaves?
The entire structure collapses because the population never internalized the principles of how to govern themselves. They only learned how to be awed into submission.
That makes total sense. True adherence to a system, in Parwez's framework, demands an intellectual realization based on arguments, evidence, and a deep understanding of cause and effect.
Right. If the foundation of your society is awe and terror, you are architecting your own ruin.
Which perfectly brings us to his profound analysis of verses 45 through 47. Because Parwez outlines the precise mechanisms by which oppressive systems inevitably collapse.
Even systems that seem utterly unbreakable. He identifies a terminal psychological condition among elite classes, which he calls self-deception.
Elite self-deception is such a fascinating sociological phenomenon. The power brokers look at their massive societal architecture.
Their monopolized supply chains, their surveillance apparatus, their military superiority.
Yeah, and they genuinely believe they have insulated themselves from the laws of social physics. They believe they have achieved a permanent state of exception from consequences.
But the text outlines 4 distinct mechanisms of civilizational collapse that shatter that deception.
Let's spend some serious time unpacking how these actually function, because Parwez is not just listing arbitrary disasters here. He is describing systemic failures.
The first mechanism is a sudden foundational collapse. The metaphor used in the text is an earthquake swallowing the society from below.
Okay, so in socioeconomic terms, the foundation is the working class, the laborers, the essential infrastructure that the elite just totally take for granted.
Exactly. The elite build their towering economic structures on top of this base. But if that base is subjected to relentless extraction, wage suppression, and systemic neglect,
it eventually reaches a point of structural failure. The collapse isn't some mystical punishment.
no, it is the mathematical reality of extracting more energy from a foundation than you put back into it. The elites wake up one day to find the bedrock of their entire economy is simply given away.
Wow. And then the second mechanism approaches from the exact opposite direction, right? Top-down destruction.
Yes, the textual metaphor is the roof falling in on them.
So how does that manifest?
This manifests as the catastrophic failure of leadership at the highest echelons. It is the arrogance of power leading to disastrous geopolitical blunders.
Or the overextension of military forces?
Or the corruption of the executive branch, to the point where the institutions of governance simply crush themselves under their own bloated weight.
The elite are crushed by the very architecture they built to protect themselves. That's poetic, but also terrifying.
Very. And the third mechanism is arguably the most complex and terrifying of all, Istidraj.
Istidraj, which translates to gradual ruin or a step-by-step internal decay.
Yeah.
This is the slow rot of a civilization.
Yes.
And it forces us to confront a really massive philosophical question here. If a system is fundamentally toxic, if it relies on the subjugation of its people, why does the divine law, the universe's operating system, allow it to run for decades, sometimes centuries before it fails?
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? Why doesn't the social physics trigger an immediate collapse the moment the system becomes oppressive?
Exactly.
Well, Parwez's explanation here relies on the linguistic nuance of Istidraj and its connection to the divine attributes of Rauf and Rahim.
Which are attributes of profound mercy and grace.
Right. A sudden, immediate collapse would afford no opportunity for course correction. The delay is not an endorsement of the toxic system. It is a diagnostic window.
A diagnostic window. Parwez uses a highly effective medical analogy in the source text for this, comparing the societal delay to the pathology of tuberculosis.
It's a brilliant analogy. When a patient first contracts TB, they don't instantly drop dead.
Right. The disease operates on a timeline. In the early stages, there is a persistent cough, maybe some unexpected fatigue, a slight fever.
These are the diagnostic markers. If the patient pays attention to these early warnings, the diagnosis is relatively straightforward, and the intervention can actually cure the disease completely.
So the gradual nature of the illness provides a window of time for the patient to realize their biological system is failing, change their environment, and seek the cure.
But what if they ignore the cough?
Right, if they write off the fatigue as just the cost of doing business and continue their toxic lifestyle.
The disease inevitably advances to a stage where it physically destroys the architecture of the lungs. At that point, it becomes incurable, and the biological collapse is absolute.
And Istidraj is that exact diagnostic window applied to macroeconomics and sociology?
The society begins to experience the early markers of disease. Widening wealth inequality, localized social unrest, the breakdown of civic trust, minor economic recessions.
And the elite usually just write those off as temporary hiccups. They apply a quick policy patch and completely ignore the underlying rot.
And that is the tragedy of Istidraj. The delay is the mercy of the system, offering a chance to restructure the foundational laws before the damage becomes terminal.
So when a toxic society appears to thrive for 50 years, the laws of consequence haven't been suspended.
Not at all. The society is merely accumulating sickness step by step. The momentum of their massive economy might keep the train rolling forward, but the engine has already failed.
And the friction is building toward an inevitable halt, which leads directly into the fourth mechanism, internal factional warfare.
Yes. When the resources begin to dwindle because the foundational economy is sick, the society doesn't even need an external enemy to destroy it.
The various factions of the elite and the polarized segments of the population, they just turn on each other. The society cannibalizes itself.
Parwez illustrates this delusion of permanence with a really chilling historical analysis of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime.
Oh, this part of the source material was intense. It describes the intoxicating atmosphere of Hitler's rallies.
The rhetoric echoed with absolute claims of invincibility and the promise of a 1,000-year Reich.
The Nazi elite looked at their mechanized army, their ruthless internal security apparatus, and their rapid territorial expansion, and they felt totally secure.
They believed they had engineered a society immune to collapse.
They believed their own mythology. They thought their architecture of violence could outsmart the fundamental laws of human dignity.
And it ended in utter catastrophic ruin in barely a decade.
The physical architecture of Berlin was leveled, not just because of opposing armies, but because the foundational laws the society was built upon were mathematically unsustainable.
The social physics demanded a collapse. You cannot build a 1,000-year structure on a foundation of structural violence. It will always tear itself apart.
Okay, this massive historical context really sets up the pivot to the cosmic scale in verses 48 through 50.
Right, zooming out.
Because we've analyzed how human societies inevitably fracture when they defy the laws of balance. Parwez now zooms out to the universe itself to answer a fundamental question.
Why does the cosmos operate with such breathtaking precision while human history is basically a graveyard of collapsed empires?
Which brings us back to the image of the prostrating shadows from the beginning of the show.
He argues that the imagery of shadows bowing down is entirely devoid of religious metaphor. It is a literal description of the absolute, involuntary submission of all physical matter to the laws designed for them.
Every single atom in the universe, the fusion reactions in the core of a star, the orbital mechanics of Jupiter, the photosynthesis in a blade of grass.
And the shadow stretching from your shoes.
Yeah.
It all submits involuntarily to a hard mathematical reality.
To explain this mechanism, Parwez redefines one of the most culturally loaded terms in the text,
Okay.
universally translated as angels.
Right, so forget the Renaissance paintings of winged beings playing harps on clouds.
Yeah, get that image out of your head entirely.
In Parwez's rationalist framework, Malaika represent the fundamental forces of nature. Gravity, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, the water cycle.
They are the unyielding, egoless executors of the physical laws.
Gravity doesn't have an ego. It never takes a day off. It doesn't demand a higher wage to keep the moon in orbit.
Right. The source text uses the localized example of the water cycle. Clouds forming over the ocean, wind currents carrying them inland, rain falling on dead earth, snow accumulating on mountain peaks.
To provide a steady release of water through the summer, these processes are the Malaika executing the divine command flawlessly.
They operate in a state of absolute involuntary submission. They literally cannot choose to rebel.
Which brings us to the terrifying implication here.
That humans are the anomaly.
Exactly. If the entire physical universe submits involuntarily, we are the one chaotic variable. We possess free will.
We are not designed to be biological robots blindly executing code. The physical universe submits by sheer force, but humans are invited to submit through the engine of reason.
We are endowed with the intellect to observe the flawless execution of the physical universe, to decipher the laws of cause and effect.
And then to consciously, voluntarily choose to align our socio-economic and political structures with those same principles of balance and equity.
But we are the only entity in the known universe capable of looking at the laws of physics and deciding to swim upstream.
We are the gear in the cosmic machine that decides it wants to spin backward just to see what happens, and in the process, we strip our own gears.
Yes, we use our free will to devise toxic, oppressive systems driven by extraction and ego.
And that is exactly why our empires collapse while the stars remain in their orbits.
This profound disconnect between the physical universe and human society culminates in Parwez's analysis of verses 51 and 52. Do not take two gods.
This is an exploration of the ultimate modern fallacy, the concept of shirk.
When we hear shirk, the mind instantly goes to ancient history. People carving wooden idols or worshiping multiple deities in a pantheon.
But Parwez drags this concept directly into the modern era, arguing that the ultimate form of shirk today is secular dualism.
It is the cognitive dissonance of splitting the universe in half.
Right. We readily accept that a single absolute law governs the physical realm. I mean, we don't argue with gravity or the speed of light or the biological requirements of the human body.
But when it comes to the socio-economic realm, we declare ourselves the ultimate unchecked sovereigns.
We basically say the physical laws can govern the weather, but the human ego will dictate the stock market, the penal code, and the distribution of resources.
And by doing so, we take two gods. We accept a divine baseline for physics, but install human ego as the god of society.
Parwez argues this dualism is fatal because it completely removes an absolute external moral baseline from our human systems.
Now, the source text dives into a very specific economic critique to illustrate why human-devised systems ultimately fail to provide justice.
Yes, Parwez uses Marxism as his primary case study here. And just to be absolutely clear to our listeners, we are unpacking Parwez's textual analysis of economic structures here. We are not endorsing a political platform.
Exactly. We're just looking at his analysis. Parwez looks at the core Marxist ideal, from each according to his capacity to each according to his need.
On paper, as a purely theoretical concept, it sounds like the definition of equity.
But Parwez argues that human-devised systems, no matter how noble their stated intentions might be, consistently fail to implement this equity in reality.
Because they rely on the human ego to enforce the distribution, rather than an absolute external moral authority.
The text provides a deeply resonant, grounded anecdote to explain this structural failure. It centers on a poor farmer.
Right. This farmer spends an entire year engaged in brutal physical labor. He tills the soil, plants the seeds, relies on the physical laws of nature, the rain, the sun, to grow his crop.
Then finally, he brings his harvest, which is the physical manifestation of his life's energy, to the market on a cart.
And waiting for him at the market is not the law of equity. It's the middleman, the broker.
This broker hasn't sweat a single drop in the fields. He hasn't expended any physical energy to create the harvest.
Yet, he sits in a position of systemic power and arbitrarily dictates the value of the farmer's labor.
The text poses the question, who sets this wage? 3 rupees. 4 rupees. Who decided that this transaction is fair?
The answer is that no absolute moral law decided it.
The human ego, prioritizing its own profit margins and wealth accumulation over human dignity, manipulated the market mechanics.
The middleman extracts the value of the farmer's labor for himself.
Parwez's overarching argument is that without a unified, absolute sovereignty setting the moral baseline for economics, a baseline that treats human dignity as a law as immutable as gravity, all human systems will eventually devolve into exploitation.
Whether you are looking at hypercapitalism or state-controlled centralized economies, if the human ego remains the ultimate sovereign, it will invariably tilt the scales in its own favor.
Which brings us to the conceptual climax of this entire deep dive, the redefinition of Tawhid, the oneness of God.
Parwez argues that true Tawhid is not merely a private, internal spiritual belief.
You cannot hold Tawhid in your heart while simultaneously operating a business that exploits your workers or participating in an economy that extracts wealth from the vulnerable.
Because that is the exact definition of the dualism he critiques. True Tawhid demands a unified field theory of existence.
It requires integrating our social, political, and economic frameworks with the exact same universal laws of balance, equity, and consequence that govern the physical cosmos.
It is the absolute rejection of the idea that human society is somehow exempt from the physics of justice.
It really is a staggering rationalist framework. It forces you to look at history, economics, and your own physical reality through an entirely different lens.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. I mean, we started with the intense psychological grief of the messenger in verse 37, establishing that empathy cannot suspend the hard law of consequences.
We analyze the concept of hijra in verse 41 not as a tragic flight, but as the social physics of defection, withdrawing capital and labor from a toxic monopoly to build a structurally sound society.
We explored the logic of human messengers in verse 43, understanding why the intellect cannot be subjugated by the ikra of supernatural miracles.
And why we must rely on the empirical data of history, the al-ajik.
We spent significant time unpacking the architecture of ruin in verses 45 through 47.
Specifically detailing how the diagnostic window of Istidraj lulls the elite into a self-deceptive delusion of permanence before their inevitable collapse.
And we concluded with the universal submission of the physical world in verses 48 through 52, realizing that human free will often leads us into the fatal trap of secular dualism.
Trying to manage our economies without the absolute moral baseline that keeps the stars from falling out of the sky.
The coherence of Parwez's analysis across these disparate fields, psychology, sociology, physics, and economics, is just what makes this particular lecture so vital.
And the exploration of human nature doesn't stop here.
No, it doesn't. We've seen how the entire physical universe submits to one law. In Lecture 415, covering Ayat 53-54, we will zoom in on the human psyche, why we turn to these laws in times of crisis, only to revert to Shirk once the pressure is off.
The psychology of convenience versus conviction, it will be a brilliant continuation.
Until we dive into that, I want to leave you with one final thought to process. Next time you are walking outside in the late afternoon and you look down at your own shadow stretching out across the pavement, ask yourself this.
Your shadow has no choice. It possesses no ego.
It is bound by the malaika of thermodynamics and light to follow the physical laws perfectly. You, however, are the anomaly.
We have a choice.
You possess the terrifying power of free will. What system are you choosing to cast your shadow in tomorrow?
The physics of your choice will dictate your reality.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.